places. Thou shalt raise up the foundations of many generations, and thou shalt be called the repairer of the breach, the restorer of paths to dwell in. Isaiah chapter 58, verse 12. In 1989, President George H.W. Bush used one, the Washington Bible, first used by George Washington at his inauguration in 1789. And in 2009, Barack Obama became the first U.S. president to reuse the Bible on which Abraham Lincoln placed his hand at his inauguration in 1861. Honest Abe's was a KJV too. But today, most of the King James Bibles I come across are battered and ragged, well-used and dusty. At our book fair, no one wants to buy them. I usually can't even give them away. So I end up burying a lot of Bibles. That's what you're supposed to do with no longer needed holy books. At the end of the fair in late July, I carry the leftovers home and get the tall shovel out of the shed. Using the heel of my right shoe, I thrust its blade deep into the soil and make a hole large enough for a dead pet. In they go. In fact, each of the three monotheistic faiths practice some form of this. There are a series of underground tunnels in the Chiltern Hills near Quetta, Pakistan, where nearly 100,000 discarded and partial Qurans are carefully packed in bags, buried, which they actually call storing in a hopeful sort of way, and then watched over by devout Muslims who feel called to the sacred task. The first of these many tunnels was dug in 1992 and measures 130 feet in length and is about 7 feet in circumference. On a much less impressive scale, someday someone will buy my old house, dig up the rear part of the garden, look to the area closest to the shed near the remnants of last year's tomato plants, and likely scratch their heads at what they find about 22 inches down. A rich heritage. For the last 2 decades, I have attended an Episcopalian church. Episcopalians, like Christians in many other denominations and churches, aren't really supposed to read the King James Version anymore. It's almost embarrassing to tell someone that you read the KJV. It can feel like admitting that your favorite television show is still Mutual of Omaha's Wild Kingdom. If it were to be spied on a table during a dinner party, a guest might assume that the attic had recently been cleaned. But I grew up with King James language. I breathed it like air. I memorized long passages that remain with me. As a kid, I rarely said anything worth repeating, but when I did, my mother would remark to my father, "Out of the mouths of babes." Psalm 8:2. Today, I can no more unhinge some of these phrases and verses from my psyche than I can go back in time and undo the mistakes that I made in high school. My Baptist grandfathers, of the old school both of them, believed for doctrinal reasons that nothing should replace the KJV. They thought it represented a pure moment in the history of human connection to God. Both preachers, they had fat black KJV study Bibles, which they shook in their hands while they preached from behind their pulpits. Alistair McGrath, one of today's finest historians, says, "It can be argued that until the end of the First World War, the King James Bible was seen not simply as the most important English translation of the Bible, but as one of the finest literary works in the English language." I still love the cadences and language of the KJV, though I cannot agree that the newer translations are deficient or unfaithful to the original text. In fact, I know the exact opposite is usually true. The New Revised Standard Version, NRSV, seems to be the preferred translation of today's academics because of its contemporary scholarship, use of the most recent manuscripts, including those discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, removal of archaisms, attention to the differences between genres, typesetting poetry as poetry, presenting the Song of Songs as drama, and so on, and the use of appropriate gender-inclusive language. But of course there are many others. For example, I know that the New International Version, NIV, and today's New International Version, TNIV, are preferred by many pastors, and quite a few poets and writers are partial to the Revised English Bible.